The front end of our app is done, but we're not yet saving our data anywhere except in the browser's memory. With Firebase, we can set up a database easily, and we don't even need to change much of our code to make it work. In this lecture, we'll find out what Firebase is all about and how we can use it. Alright, so we've got our application for the most part pretty well done, but there's one giant problem that still remains, and that's the fact that we can't actually save any of this data. As we've seen, anytime we go to save a new classified, and we maybe put in a new item here and say save, we get it showing up, but then anytime we refresh the page, the item goes away. And that's to be expected. What we've done so far is we've just set things up for the client side. We haven't actually set up any kind of data persistence on the server side. So in this section, we're going to set up data persistence. We're going to be able to save our data to a server and then read it back and be able to refresh the page but still have our data show up. And to do this, we're going to make use of a service called Firebase. And Firebase is a real-time data store. And so we'll get a bit more into what a real-time data store is and what it does in just a little bit. But what we should do first is think about how we might typically deal with the server side from an Angular application. And so if we remember over here in our application, right now we've got this factory that uses the HTTP service to make a GET request for some data. And this data right now is just living locally. We've got it right here within our data folder. And all of this JSON data here is what is being used for the application. Now, in a real life scenario, you wouldn't be reading data that exists within a folder in your project, but rather you'd be reading some data from a remote data source. And just by way of example, why don't we actually do that? Why don't we read some data from a remote source? And to do that, let's just come over here to our controller and maybe just right below the classifieds factory bit here, let's use HTTP again. So we can do HTTP GET. And then we can go to HTTPS, we'll do api.github.com, and then let's go to the users endpoint. And then since this returns a promise, we tap into it with the then method, and we provide a callback. And within that callback, we have a response. And then for now, let's just log that response out. We'll do console.log response. All right, so taking a look at this in the browser, if we head back over and let's just open up the console and refresh this. All right, so you see here we've got an object that's come back, and this object has on it an array of data. This array contains objects, and each object is a user. This is the list of the first 30 users that comes back from GitHub's API. So the important thing to note here is that this URL that we put in right here, api.github.com/users, that is an endpoint. That is a spot at which we will get some data if we send a GET request. And so then when you're interacting with a backend and you want to maybe save data to a database, you could do something like HTTP post. And then you would just put in your URL right there, and you would use the then method again to handle the response. And then if you wanted to, say, update some data, you would use HTTP put, and then you can delete data with HTTP delete. And so this all relies on having a backend, a server-side setup that will respond to each of these request types. So GitHub's API has something set up where it will respond to a GET request at this endpoint, and it will return the data from their database that we've requested. In this quick example, we won't be able to post or put or delete anything to that endpoint, but that's conceptually how things would go. All right, so that is kind of the typical way of interacting with a backend with Angular, but that's not the only way. And a good way to get a sense for how to save data to a backend is to use something like Firebase instead of setting up our own server. And so Firebase, once again, is a real-time data store that allows us to build apps without having to build our own backend infrastructure. And so this is great, but one of the implications of it is that the way we interact with data, the API for interacting with data in Firebase, is going to look a little bit different than what we just saw in the previous example. But Firebase actually makes it really easy. They provide a lot of good documentation, and they actually provide their own SDK for Angular specifically. So if we go over here to the docs, we can look up Angular Fire. And Angular Fire is the library for use with Angular applications. So Firebase has actually done all of the heavy lifting when it comes to making their service accessible in Angular applications. And all that we need to do now is just plug into it. All right, so as the first step, why don't we sign up for a new account? So let's head over here. We'll sign up with Google. And then I've already got some email addresses in there, so I'll just choose this one. And I'll say, yes, I would like to allow Firebase to view my email address and my basic profile info. And then it will automatically go through the process of signing me up. All right, so there's the welcome message, and let's come down and as a first step, create an application. So just as a note, the application name that I put here is going to mean that it's now reserved, and you'll have to put in your own application name. But I'm just going to call this NG Classifieds. All right, so I'll say create new app. There we go, Firebase created successfully. And let's just take a look inside to see what we've got. If we come over here to manage app, and then what we'll see here is our Firebase data area. And so what we've got right now is this ng classifieds key, and it's set to null. And we see this location is empty, but we can add data in by clicking the plus sign. So let's try that. Let's hover over here and click plus. And then we get this option to put in a new key value pair. So we could say name, and maybe we'll just call this first name. And the value maybe is Ryan. We'll say add. And so what we get is our first name, which is the key, and then a string for the value, which is my first name. And then we can keep adding on here if we wanted to. We could add some more things in. And what we can actually do is click into that key that we just made. And where we are now is one level deeper within our data structure. All right, so let's actually get an idea now of how we would interact with this data from our code. And to do that, let's actually see an example first of just some plain JavaScript. We won't touch the Angular implementation just yet. We'll just get a look with some plain JavaScript first. And to do that, let's actually use JSBin. Let's go to jsbin.com. And this is just a quick way to get some demoing in. We don't want to actually spend the time to set up a new project, but we can see everything we need to from here. So let's go to add library, and we'll look for Firebase. We can add in Firebase. It brings it in with a script tag. So now we've got access to the firebase.js library. And so let's come over here and we'll open up our JavaScript panel, and we can actually close our HTML just for the time being. The first thing we're going to need here is a reference to our Firebase. So we can say var ref equals a new Firebase, and then we have to pass in the URL to our actual Firebase. And that URL is actually this URL up here. So we can just grab everything from here after com, and then we'll copy everything that we see. And let's come back over here and paste it in. All right, so we've got our reference pointing to our Firebase now. And maybe the first thing that we'll want to do is actually save some data into our Firebase. So we could do something like ref set, and then we could pass in maybe just a string. So let's say Ryan. All right, so now if we come back over to our Firebase, what we'll see if we go back up top to our ng classifieds is that we've now got ng classifieds pointing to a value of Ryan. So if we come back over here and we set it to maybe our first name and last name, well, we can come back over and now it's set to Ryan Chenke. So that's all it took to save some data to a database, just 2 lines of code. And obviously we'll want to be able to read some data, so let's see how we can do that. Let's actually get rid of ref.set. So what we can do is we can say ref.on, and then we're looking for a value from our Firebase. And what we can do is say in the function we want to have a snapshot, and then we want to maybe write this out to the screen or something. And let's actually come over to our HTML, and we'll just give an ID to the body tag. We'll say ID is equal to data, something like that. Coming back over here, what we can do is say document.getElementById, and this is just kind of a quick way to get our element. And then we'll say the inner HTML of that, we want to make it equal to snapshot.val. All right, so you can see there, it's already showing up, the value from our Firebase. Now here's the cool thing, because Firebase is a real-time data store, it's going to show changes to the data immediately. So let's see how that works. Let's come over here and just grab this tab and maybe make it into a new window so that we can put things side by side. And just keep an eye here on the value as we make a change over here. So maybe just deleting the last name, for instance. If we hit enter, it shows up immediately on JSBin. And so that is one of the major benefits of Firebase, is that whenever we make a change here, the change shows up immediately wherever a user has our data open. So like I mentioned earlier, Firebase has its own library for Angular, and it's called Angular Fire. So this is the library that's going to allow us to get Firebase hooked up to our Angular app in a very simple way. And we'll get rolling with that in the next video.